Hello, my name is John Horton. I'm an assistant professor at NYU Stern School of Business, and this is my paper, Price Floors and Employer Preferences, Evidence from a Minimum Wage Experiment. So the University of Chicago has this poll that they do periodically with economists, posing different questions about public policy. And several years ago, they posed the question, raising the federal minimum wage to $9 per hour would make it noticeably harder for low-wage employers to find employment. And this is the distribution of responses. You can see that they're centered at uncertain, and there's about equal weight on agree and disagree. So the lack of consensus is not for a lack of trying. As many people familiar with the minimum wage literature in the US know, it's a kind of a challenging literature, at least partially. There's disagreement about what variation in minimum wages you can use and can't use, and whether or not different experimental units are comparable to each other. Then there's also other issues where some of the things that we might think are important just aren't measured that well in the data sets that we have. So, we measure total head counts reasonably well, but hours worked much less well. And finally, a lot of the things that we think might matter, seeing how firms adjust, so they might take and change prices or cut back on amenities, or we might have a problem with compliance, different margins of adjustment, they're not likely to show up in the data sets that we have. So this paper is about minimum wage policies, but it's far from conventional. What I do in this paper is I use data from a true experiment that was conducted on an online labor market. And I have an experiment that I'll discuss, and then I'll eventually talk about a platform-wide imposition of a minimum wage. So we have both a true experiment and essentially an event study. And so we get from this paper is excellent measurement. Because of the computer-mediated context that I'm going to describe, a lot of the things that we care about are measured essentially without error. And the question about what is the source of variation is off the table. It's a true experiment. And the sample size is quite large, so we'll be able to look at the effects on over 160,000 job openings. So just to take you through the context, the agenda, take two. So to take you through the agenda, I'll discuss a little bit more about the empirical context, the design, the results of the experiment. Then I'll talk about when the platform imposed a market-wide minimum wage and what happened and how those results match up with the experimental results, and then I'll conclude. So the context for this experiment was a large online labor market, and it's for work that can be done remotely. So you should be thinking about things like computer programming, graphic design, data entry. One distinguishing feature of this marketplace is it focuses primarily on hourly contracts. And hourly contracts, the hours worked are measured essentially without error. And how that works is the platform provides the workers, freelancers, with software that essentially serves as a digital punch clock, and it logs how many hours they work on a contract, and this is how they get paid. So one upshot of that is we have excellent measurement on hours worked, conditional upon a match being formed. So how it typically works, how the matching process typically works is employer posts a job. So here someone looking for some statistical help, they indicate that it's an hourly job, they write a description, they tag it with some skills. Workers find these jobs, see if they're a good match, read the description, answer some questions, write a cover letter, and then at the bottom they have to propose an hourly rate. So they're free to pick any hourly rate they want, at least status quo before any experiment. The employer then gets a whole collection of applicants, and these applicants, they can see how much the worker bid, and they can see a number of productivity relevant worker attributes, or at least attributes the employer might think are related to productivity. So feedback that they've gotten on past projects, how many hours they've worked, what country they're from, etc. So the design of the experiment was intended to create a counterfactual in which a job opening would get the same applicants that it would have gotten had it been in the control group, but all those workers who would have bid below the minimum wage would now bid up to at least that assigned minimum. And so the focus really was to create that counterfactual and then see how employers reacted. Did they still hire? Did they change the kind of workers that they hired? If they formed a match, were the characteristics of that match different? And so randomization was at the level of the employer, and there were 3 active treatment groups. So there was a $2 an hour, a $3 an hour, and a $4 an hour minimum wage. And then there was a control group that had the status quo of no minimum wage. And that group got 75% of the sample. So when workers apply to a job, they read the job description, they write a cover letter, they potentially have to answer some questions, and then the last thing that they do is propose an hourly wage. And so how this was, how the minimum wage was actually enforced is when workers got to this point and they went to submit a wage bid, if it was below the minimum wage for that assigned job opening, they were told that they needed to bid up. And at this point, the application costs were all sunk, and so there was really no reason for the workers not to put in a higher number. The dialog box that popped up didn't tell them how much higher they needed to be because we wanted to avoid bunching right at the minimum wage. But we had this page instrumented, and so we could detect if people were bouncing away from it and sort of abandon an application rather than submit the higher wage bid. And there was no evidence that they did. And I think this is just consistent with the fact that applications are pretty cheap on this platform, and there's really no reason to conserve them. So if you're told to bid higher, you might as well, especially since the costs are all sunk. And so what this did was it created applicant pools that would differ depending on your treatment assignment as an employer. So if you're in the control, that worker that bid $1.11 is still going to show up at $1.11. If that employer was counterfactually in MW2, they would not see $1.11. They would see $2 plus some epsilon based on how much that worker actually bid up. One could be failed randomization. There's no evidence of this. The openings are well balanced across cells. We have a lot of pre-treatment job opening characteristics we can look at, and we're well balanced. One possibility is that maybe workers can kind of change the composition of these applicant pools by sorting across openings. This would actually be logistically difficult based on how the experiment was designed. So you don't actually hit the box until you go ahead and try to submit a wage bid where you learn that something is maybe a little bit different. And so you'd only have to learn this by experience, and as it is, workers showed no interest in sort of abandoning an application once they realized they couldn't enter their preferred bid. And consistent with this, the application counts and the applicant pool characteristics are actually well balanced across the cells. Another possibility is that the firms are the ones that sort across platforms or time or displaced offline work. What I mean by displaced and sorting across time is maybe they try posting another job opening to see if they can, quote unquote, get away from our cells. So one, we actually have, for the question of sorting across platforms, we have data from another platform that at the time had a lower minimum wage. We don't see any evidence that employers push their job openings over to that alternative platform. We don't have any evidence that they tried to post more job openings or avoid the cell. Their ex-post behavior sort of looks very similar. And survey evidence we have, it suggests that there's not a lot of substitutability between online and offline, and that employers are basically just posting jobs on one platform at a time. And lastly, on the sorting across platforms, reposting wouldn't have worked because all subsequent job posts by an employer got the exact same treatment cell. Another threat to internal validity would be market-moving violations of the SUTVA condition. And this is one of the reasons why we had actually a relatively small active treatment cell. So only 25% of employers got any form of. One question that comes up is whether or not $2 per hour is actually much of a minimum wage. And so here I show the kernel density in the control group with the $2, $3, and $4 an hour minimum wages overlaid. And you can see this is for all job openings, so this isn't even trying to find job openings where the minimum wage is likely to have more bite. You can see, you're probably above the 25th percentile with a $4 an hour minimum wage. This is a pretty high minimum wage for this market. In terms of compliance, did it actually work? Well, in the top panel, this shows the distribution of realized wages in the control group, and you can see there's substantial mass to the left of $4 an hour. And for 2, 3, and 4, you can see essentially there's no mass to the left. There's a tiny amount, and what that's from, a little bit of mass to the left, that's from workers that offered refunds to employers later. And so I average that in, and so it was possible that the worker could give a refund to the employer who's not satisfied, but that, as you can see, that's fairly rare in the data. Now, like this experiment and really any minimum wage work, there's this question of where to look for effects. If we take the high-level categories of work in the marketplace, the lowest wage, the fast food of online labor is administrative support. And so you can see that the median down there is about $4 an hour with a kind of substantial left tail. But you can also see that there's lots of low-wage jobs in other categories of work. And if you look to the right tail of administrative jobs, there's some that pay over $10 an hour. And we'd like to target those as well. And so when I report results, I'm going to show it for 3 groups. I'll always show all, or I'll pool all job openings together, regardless of what the category is. I'll show results for the administrative category. And then finally, I'll show for those that have a low predicted wage. And how I'm going to do that is by using historical data from the platform to create a model of what a job is likely to pay based on the category, the text of the job description, the title, and a couple of other factors that are related to what a job is ultimately going to pay. And so I'll take and then use that model with my experimental sample to predict what a job would pay, and then select those that would pay less than $5 an hour as another sample to look at. So now let me get into the results. So now we'll get into the experimental results. So we're going to look at 3 sets of results. So we'll look at prices, so the wages of the hired workers. We'll look at quantities. In particular, we'll look at the extensive margin, so whether or not anyone was hired for a job opening, as well as the hours that were worked conditional upon a hire. And then lastly, we'll be looking at the attributes of the hired workers. So we'll be looking at things like their past wages, their profile rates, their past earnings, and so on. So I'm going to present the results. In the y-axis here, we have the difference relative to the control group. And so for the wage of a hired worker, these are in log points, so we can interpret these approximately as percentages. And then in the bottom, I have indicators for the $2, $3, and $4 an hour minimum wage cells. So we can see here that in NW4, hired worker wages were about 14% higher. If you want to see that in table form, this is just the results of a regression of the wage of the hired worker on the indicator. We can see that in MW3 and MW2, it's positive. The effect is highly significant. And it's approximately, or it is increasing in the size of the minimum wage. So if we look at our subgroups where we expected to find stronger effects, sure enough, in administrative support and in low predicted wage, we see much stronger effects. Wages in MW4 were as much as 40% higher in admin and low predicted wage. Why did wages increase? Well, there's at least 3 possibilities. There could be a markup effect where the same worker who would have been hired in the control is now hired in a treatment group, albeit at a higher wage. We could have selection effects where the jobs that would have paid low wages just went unfilled, and so they don't show up in our data. And finally, we could have a substitution effect where the employer still hires, but they hire a different kind of worker, one that's more productive and that commands higher wages. So to disentangle or kind of quantify the contribution of these different hypotheses, we need to quantify what a worker looked like at the moment of application. And so when a worker applies, employers can see what that worker looked like at a moment in time. And one piece of information that you have is what that worker is listed as their hourly rate. Now this is separate from a wage bid that's conditioned on a particular job opening. this is an hourly rate that they post on a profile where employers, say, who are looking for applicants to recruit would see this wage. And because it's used for recruiting purposes, workers have an incentive to keep it close to what they consider their market wage. And so using that using that profile rate, we can actually compute a markup for hired workers, which I'm going to define as their hired wage minus their profile wage divided by their profile wage. And what we can see is that workers that were hired in the active treatment cells had substantially higher markups than those in the control. So this is consistent with employers hiring, not necessarily the same workers, but they are hiring workers at kind of an above market wage. That it's not just purely because they're hiring a different kind of worker. We see the same worker getting hired for a higher wage. Next, we turn to quantities, and this will speak somewhat to the possibility that selection is driving the effects. So if we want to look at the outcome, whether or not any worker was hired, and this is in levels, not logs, we can see kind of a clear negative effect, and it's increasing in the minimum wage. So the higher the minimum wage, the less likely an employer is to hire. But these effects actually aren't that large. So even in MW4, this is only a 2 percentage point reduction, and given the baseline fill rate, this is only about a 4% drop. Now, if we look at the other groups, the admin and the low predicted wage, I think surprisingly we don't see effects that are that much larger. They're somewhat larger, but for example, in MW3, in the admin group decrease, it's not even significant. In none of the $2 an hour cells do we have significance, despite in these groups $2 an hour being a high wage relative to the distribution in the control group. So that's the extensive margin, but we can also look at the intensive margin. So this is the hours worked by the hired worker, and here we see a kind of a different story. So this is in log hours worked. We see large reductions in hours worked, as much as 30% in MW4 and in MW3, about similar, 20 to 30%. So these are pretty large reductions. Now, why the reduction in hours worked? Well, there's several possibilities again. So one, firms just reduce the scope of projects when labor costs are higher. So you could kind of think of this as just a demand curve slope down story. Potentially morale effects, where firms hiring the same workers, but they're made more efficient and complete projects more quickly, so they just work harder. And a related idea is that you could have labor substitution, where if the firm is hiring more productive, higher wage workers that can complete projects more quickly, we would see hours worked go down. And so to look at this one, we can take and go back to our attributes of workers at the time they applied to a job and use proxies for productivity. So we can look at their total earnings, hours worked, past average wages. And so when we do this, this analysis in here is for 3 different outcomes. So their log cumulative past earnings on the platform, their average past wages, and their hired profile rate, the hired worker profile rate. We see substantial kind of shifting towards more productive workers. So in MW4, for example, average past wages are about 15% higher in the low predicted wage group. It's about similarly sized effects for the profile rate. And so really what we see is employers are strongly shifting towards more productive workers. So, to the questions that I had posed, so why do wages increase? Some of it seems to be substitution towards higher wage workers and a markup effect. The size of the change in the fraction of jobs that are filled doesn't leave much space for a selection effect. Now, in terms of why do hours worked decrease, partially it could be explained by the substitution towards more productive workers. So if we think if you hire someone who's 10% more productive, projects are going to get completed 10% more quickly. I don't have any evidence on endogenous project size or efficiency wage effects, but these are certainly possibilities that could explain some of the reduction. I think to kind of tie the experimental results together, just imagine that there's some competitive wage and efficiency units, and workers kind of bounce around that because of they perceive, idiosyncratic kind of compensating differentials in a job, or maybe they're making a mistake, or something that just kind of pulls them off of this what we think of as the competitive wage. But the firms also have a reservation wage for the job with this red line. And if we put a worker's technical productivity on, or they put their productivity on the y-axis and their hourly wage bid on the x-axis, what firms, the preferences of a firm here, right, as drawn, are A, B, and C, and they prefer all of that to not making a hire. Well, if I impose a minimum wage and I force A to snap over to A prime, the firm's preferences change. Now they prefer B to A to C to no hire. If I keep pushing the wage up, notice now I've induced a preference for C over B over A, and C was my highest wage worker. And I've now gotten to the point where I've basically priced A out of the market, where A is below what the firm is willing to pay. And so I think that this could, a simple explanation, or this simple story could explain why we seem to get fairly large substitution effects, fairly large intensive margin effects on hours worked, but not much on the extensive margin. So I find substantial evidence of labor-labor substitution as a margin of adjustment. And this possibility in response to minimum wages is not new. Economists have recognized that this might be one of the ways that firms adjust, but typically they haven't found much evidence from it, with some exceptions. But one of the features in conventional minimum wage research, it's typically examined by looking at employment for some demographic group, not typically what we do here, where we actually have these kind of fairly precise proxies for productivity. So as an exercise, it's useful to try to use the same demographics-focused approach to look for substitution and see what we would find. So in our context, countries, the country that a worker is from is highly correlated with their average wage. So you see workers from the US have systematically the highest wages of any workers on the platform. And what I've done here is this is just a table of regression results where the outcome is going to be an indicator for whether or not a worker was hired from that particular country. And so I have them ordered by US, India, Philippines, Bangladesh, and this matches average wages on the platform. It's the same ordering. And so if you look at these regressions, you can see, for the US, we can detect the labor-labor substitution in the sense that US workers are considerably more likely to be hired. If you look kind of the constant, you can see that the baseline is only about 7%. It jumps up by about 3% in MW4. So that's a big shift. However, it's really only noticeable in MW4. That's where the effect is. You actually would kind of pick it out pretty readily. If you look at India and Philippines, not much is going on. In Bangladesh, it's only at MW4 at the very highest rate where you see kind of a detectable decline in the fraction of workers from Bangladesh that are getting hired, and even then, it's only about 10% fewer. And this is despite the fact that we know at MW3 and MW2 we had substantial labor-labor substitution in terms of our productivity attributes, but in terms of demographic characteristics, we really wouldn't be able to detect it. So to summarize the experimental findings, we find a large increase in the hourly wages. We don't see much reduction in hiring, even at the very highest minimum wages, but we do see large reductions in hours worked, even when there seems to be no reduction in hiring at all. So it's not just a selection story. It appears to be something about composition. And in terms of composition, we do find a substantial substitution towards more productive workers, at least as captured by the proxies that we have for productivity. So the fact that firms seem to strongly shift towards these more productive workers, this kind of raises this obvious question about, well, what would happen in equilibrium if all firms tried to hire more productive workers that would bid up their wages? Equilibrium results might look very different from the experimental results. And so I think you could probably imagine a model where what's going to matter here is how elastic these high type workers are. So if they can kind of expand the amount of work that they do very readily, we're not going to get much of a bidding up effect. Vice versa, if they tend to be inelastic, either their wages are going to rise so much that some of that intensive margin effect that we see might get turned into an extensive margin effect where employers stop filling their jobs because they're too expensive and there's sort of no one they can substitute from. But we can be empirical about this because we have something that approximates the equilibrium outcome. After the experiment was concluded, the platform publicly announced and then imposed a platform-wide $3 an hour minimum wage. So one of our cells got implemented for everyone. And so what I'm going to do is analyze job openings posted just before and just after both the announcement of the minimum wage and the imposition. And what that'll allow me to do is I can compare the experimental estimates to these plausibly equilibrium estimates. And so first, just looking to see if anyone is hired. If we look at the actual window of jobs posted around when the platform announced that they were going to impose a minimum wage, you can see the post indicator. So this is just a symmetric window. With this event study approach, we see nothing. There's no evidence that the probability of job fills changes. So we don't think that employers were rushing, say, to fill their job openings. So if we switch over to 1 year prior, so think of this as a placebo year, do the same as event study analysis, there doesn't seem to be much going on. Maybe in the post-period, fill rates were slightly higher. Now, so it doesn't look like the announcement did very much. Now, if we go to the actual imposition, so this was the year when the minimum wage was actually imposed, we see essentially, again, a precisely estimated 0. If we go back a year, we can see essentially the same precise 0 around the imposition date, but a year prior. So it's a little simpler rather than presenting the 4 different event studies to create a diff and diff-like outcome here. And so what I have is, on the left side, I have the minimum wage being announced, and the right side, the minimum wage being imposed. And the point estimates here are the difference between the pre and post, the post minus the pre, and then the year prior subtracted out. And then so on the x-axis, it's for different sized post-period windows. And I've overlaid on top of that in colors the different point estimates from the minimum wage experiment. So for example, you can see at 7 days afterwards, the point estimates are all quite close to what we found in MW3. And then for each post period, I have 3 different point estimates corresponding to different sized pre-period windows as kind of a robustness check. Now, at 7 days, these observational estimates look very similar to the experimental estimates, but as we go forward in time, we actually see that it looks like the fill rate actually increases, that the probability of the job being getting someone hired actually increases. And what seems to likely be the culprit is that as time goes on after the minimum wage is imposed, you see a smaller fraction of administrative support jobs getting posted. And so here you can see 2 time series actual, and then a year before, there's a pretty big gap after about 45 days. So it's some possibility that employers stop posting these administrative support types of jobs. So for our other outcomes, this is the log hourly rate of the hired worker, the profile rate, average past wages, hours worked, and this is all with respect to the announcement. And you can see we have a whole bunch of zeros for all of these. Essentially, after the announcement, nothing seemed to happen. But if we look at after the imposition, Here we have the log hourly rate of the hired worker. In the weeks following the imposition, the point estimates are pretty stable, and we can see that they're pretty close or maybe a little bit above the point estimate we got in MW3. So the blue horizontal line is pretty close to all these diff and diff-like point estimates. If we look and do this for the other outcomes, essentially all of them follow that pattern where as far out as 50 days, we can see the experimental estimates are quite close to the observational estimates. The one exception is the profile rate of the worker, where it's considerably higher. But again, the profile rate is something that the worker could actually adjust. So what seems to have happened is the worker went in who had a too low profile rate and then revised it up. So we get much larger effects on the profile rate, which is kind of unsurprising once you sort of think about how it's different from, say, the average pass wage, which isn't quite as manipulatable, or it's not manipulatable at all. So returning to the question that I posed on the first slide about does this make it harder for workers, low-skilled workers, to find work? Well, we can detect that in our data by looking at workers before and after the imposition of the minimum wage, and taking workers and looking at those who were bidding below the minimum wage versus those who are above. So we're going to interact this post indicator with a whole bunch of indicators for where a worker's average wage bids were in the pre-period. And because workers send multiple applications, I can actually include a worker-specific fixed effect. And so I'm getting this within worker estimate. And so I'm going to look at two outcomes: the wage bid of the applicants. So we can see, did the treatment actually affect how workers bid? So we should see workers who are sort of way above the minimum wage really shouldn't change, and those who are below should have to bid up. And down here on the x-axis, I have the actual those indicators for the band. And the second outcome I'm going to look at is whether or not that particular application was a success. So our unit of analysis here is going to be the individual job application. And this red vertical line here indicates, to the left, those are indicators for workers who are bidding below the $3 an hour minimum wage in the pre-period. And so, as before, I'm going to do both the actual minimum wage imposition year and the placebo year. And what you can see is these workers who are down below the threshold have to bid up considerably in the post-period. And so once the minimum wage was imposed, they had to raise their bids substantially. Now, how this actually manifests itself in hiring is we can see that in the year where the minimum wage was actually imposed, those workers who had to bid up, their hire rate kind of really plummets, falls down considerably. And given the average success rate of an application, these are large effects. Now, workers can do things like send more applications. In the paper, I discuss this, but it doesn't seem like they were able to compensate very much and just sort of got displaced by workers a little higher up the distribution. Now, you can notice, Pat, on the other side of the cutoff, we don't really see too much going on. This could be consistent with those workers being pretty elastic and kind of displacing those workers pretty readily. We also did see some apparent reduction in the kind of workers that the kind of jobs that these workers focused on. So that could also be the story why we don't see kind of a bump there. So some concluding thoughts. So labor substitution ends up being an important story in the paper. I think it can kind of we have clear evidence that it occurs. It likely is part of the explanation for why we don't see big, extensive margin effects. It's also potentially the explanation of why we see pretty large intensive margin effects, or by hiring more productive workers. I think it's plausible that this kind of thing happens more in conventional markets than we might realize, and that our measures of productivity that rely on demographics aren't that well suited to picking it up. If we think a lot of productivity differences in a group are within rather than between, you can kind of have this hidden sorting. So that's it for this. That's the title of the paper. my name again. There's a link to the latest draft of the paper, and these slides themselves are also available at that link.